Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Briancrombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. A young lady that I've followed for quite a while in Mississauga politics and social services is joining us tonight. Michelle Bilek is her name, and she is really quite an impressive individual involved in a plethora of not-for-profits, charitable organizations, and different roundtables and other organizations, really to help numerous different causes in regards to poverty, homelessness, and affordable housing. Michelle Bilek is a people-oriented leader, commencement, development, and implementation of social services programs, policies, and government relations strategies as the principal consultant for an organization called Real People Collaborative. Michelle Bilek, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much, Brian, for having me.
It's my pleasure. I think as we chatted before the show started, I've known of you quite a bit. I've heard about you quite positively from some of the people I've worked with in the past, but I'm not sure if I've actually ever met you. And so it's a real pleasure to actually meet you. And I've obviously seen your signs up on different lawns as I've traveled around the city and checked you out on your websites and things like this. So it's a real pleasure to meet you. You said that if you don't have an affordable housing solution, that's the biggest issue. People have got to have a place to live. Is that your big issue right now?
Oh, yeah, certainly. I mean, even when I first ran back in 2008, way back when I used to go door knocking and talk about the issues that were affecting me in my life, right? My story, right? The story of myself and what experiences I've had in my life. And that I could very much see it around me, despite the fact that a lot of issues sometimes are very hidden, especially in our community, way back in the day, right? So we're talking about early 2000s, and I went door knocking, and I would start talking to people, and they would say, like, what are some of the issues that you champion? And I would certainly say homelessness, housing precarity, poverty, intersectional issues of all of those things, and food security. And I really have been sort of embedded in the community and doing this grassroots work for a very long time. So I was very aware of the circumstances that a plethora of people were having, including myself and in my situation growing up. So I would champion those causes, and it wasn't that often where people would say, "What are you talking about, homelessness?" and slam the door. We don't have any homelessness, folks, and slam the door. And I don't think it helped, that our mayor actually, that's a quote from her. We don't have homelessness people here in Mississauga. I remember her saying that, and I was just shaking my head because maybe it wasn't so visible as it is now with encampments and folks sleeping rough, but the shelters have always been full. Couch surfing has always been a thing, right? People sleeping in their cars. It happens.
That was
It
one of the things
happens.
that I was frankly shocked at. I participated in one of these coldest night of the year. I think it was called events a little
Mhm.
while back, where I had to sleep in my car for a night in a parking lot. And I think it was January, February, and it was very cold out. And I had an SUV, and I brought in a mattress, and I had two sleeping bags and a parka. So I was outfitted like probably many other people, most other people that were really doing the sleeping in the car were not. And we were briefed ahead of
Mhm.
time about how big the problem is, and that homelessness in Toronto you see on the streets, but homelessness in Mississauga is primarily in a car. And
Mhm.
um, and I had to walk into a local Tim's, twice during the evening
Oh yeah.
to make use of the facilities. And I was surprised how many homeless were actually in the Tim's
Yep.
and walking into the Tim's to grab a coffee, to stay a little bit warm, and to make use of the facilities. Um, it was
Yeah.
an incredible experience and it was only one night, but that one night, I remember it to this day. Obviously, it had a real impact on me. Um,
Yeah. Well,
I
I
walked
was.
down in the waterfront in Mississauga, and I'm surprised how many people are living in tents or in little lean-tos.
Mhm. Yeah, it's the reality. And that story about you going into the Tim Hortons, that was my story. That was my story. I was lucky enough to have a car. So it was. during the time when I was in university, and foreclosure of the house. Our family, we all went in separate ways, and um, that's where I was while I was going to university.
You were
And
going to university and you
yep,
were homeless in
yep.
Mississauga,
No, actually, I was going to McMaster at the time. Yeah.
but
Hmm.
you were homeless, living in a car.
Hmm.
Seriously.
Yeah, yeah. Well, a university has a gym. You can go and take a shower, right? Yeah, and when you have a car, you can basically stick all your belongings, whatever you have left in the back seat, and you can. Well, I was lucky enough. I was also had a part-time job at a hotel, and usually worked nights, and so I worked in room service, so it was kind of a bonus because I could, grab some grub and yeah, just make it work. And I think when you're in those situations, it really is one of those things. For one, you don't usually talk about it. At least I didn't back then. But you just are just sort of going through the motions, and it's a very embarrassing situation. And I do remember in my car on campus, I had a night class, um, and I'm telling this story because I think this is sort of the sort of pinnacle point where I just said I realized to myself like, yeah, I guess I am technically homeless at this point, right? And so I was in my car and I was taking a nap, and there was a snowstorm, and I had to go to an evening class, and the snow was really building up, and I assumed that they were going to be canceling classes at that point, and I was sleeping, I was napping, and then I hear a knock on the window, scared the living bejeebies out of me.
Imagine.
Yeah, I crack open the window, and it was a security person on campus, and he sort of looked into my car and said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm just taking a nap." And he sort of paused and said, "Well, you can't sleep here, right?" Because he saw my whole car packed with things, right? Garbage bags full of items. And I think it was at that moment I said yes, okay, and I sort of started up my car and went to the went to the Tim Hortons, which sometimes I end up doing overnight anyway, and that's where I end up staying, was in the strip mall parking lot for most of the time after that point, because I was so embarrassed, and yeah, that was that was the time when I really thought to myself, okay, yeah, this is my situation, and how am I going to get out of it? And to be honest with you, I think it's very difficult for people, for one, to navigate. So how, like, where do I go? What services are available? And then also there's just that pride, I think, too, right? Um, how, how am I going to tell people that this is my living situation? Like, it's just not one of those things in social situations you discuss, right? But my family went through a lot of ups and downs for various different reasons, and I'd have to say that I was lucky enough to have incredible family members around me, and we were able to pull our resources together and eventually, after quite a long time, be able to get ourselves out of it. But that doesn't necessarily happen to everyone, right? There's other compounding issues, and people end up, spiraling out and down a rabbit hole of substance use and various other things, just to numb them of their personal situations. And maybe it's just also just who I am, but and family, of course, us just coming together and pooling our resources and getting ourselves out of it eventually, that I am where I am today. But I also have to say that those experiences obviously have impacted the work that I do on a daily basis, what I consider my mission, and also, um, what I'd like to say is my personal and internal strength. Sometimes the difficult situations we go through actually make us a stronger human being. They make us more resilient, but they also make us more empathetic to others. And so that's sort of what has always driven my work in the community. It's certainly, when I've put my name on the ballot, I certainly know as an NDPer in Mississauga, you ain't gonna win. Brian, right? You have a very low chance that it's going to come your way. But it's always been about speaking about the issues that, my story, the story of self, how, and that becomes a story of us and then that story of us becomes a story of change, right? So you'd be surprised that when I share, other people share their struggles too, and whether that's a death in the family, taking care of a family member, again, losing a job, um, many of these various different experiences that we have in our life put us in difficult situations, and sometimes it's just really about sharing and then being able to say, hey, you know what? I've been there, and because I've been sort of doing this work for a long time, I can provide some resources or connections, or reach out to people and help you out. And so that's sort of what I've ended up doing is speaking my truth, and you find that other people have similar situations, and really that's how you advocate and bring about change.
Michelle, thank you for sharing that personal story. What is your mission then? Is it to advocate for change?
I think so. I think so. We're sort of at a very difficult time. I think the pandemic brought a lot of issues to the forefront around economic, social experiences people were having. Political discourses beyond our borders are haunting. They're haunting me, and could have a profound effect, I think, on all of us. I've always been sort of very politically astute, and I pay attention to what's happening, and the language and the policies that our elected officials embed, and how they can affect the short and long term. So I really do think that it's important to stay connected to people, and because I guess I've sort of, like you said, been around for a long time, beyond partisanship, I've always established relationships with various different people on different levels. Again, lived experts on the ground, to our mayors, to our leaders in elected government, and all the folks around them. Because I talk about the issues and solution making, because it's funny that we have these crises, but it doesn't take much to do some research and say, hey, you know what? This is working here. Why can't we appropriate it here? What will that take? And just sort of being able to suggest some solutions that sometimes are just, they're socially responsible, but then in many times they're fiscally responsible solutions. So yeah, this is sort of the work I've been doing for a long time, working with the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness for a very long time. I had those opportunities to really talk about solution making, again, from an intersectional and diverse lens.
Fascinating conversation tonight with Michelle Bilek about homelessness, about affordability, about poverty, about lack of food. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes with Michelle Bilek, a very well-known and involved activist in the Mississauga Peel region. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I think, the week before Easter, we're right in the middle of Ramadan. Passover's coming. I think it is appropriate to talk about homelessness and affordability and poverty and food and numerous different topics. But our guest tonight, Michelle Bilek, is very oriented right now on homelessness. And so I think that's going to be the major conversation. I got to tell you, I've always been really impressed with Michelle. Never meeting her, but seeing her political signs, checking out her websites and wondering what she's all about. She is a board director of the Regional Diversity Roundtable and has been for the last 12 years in Peel. She's a board member secretary of the Mayo Health and Community Services, which was formerly called the Peel HIV/AIDS Network. She's on as a national organizer on the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, a member of the board of directors of the Advocacy Center for Tenants Association, a senior advisor. She was in Hamilton. She has been very involved as the freelance person in the International Society of Female Professionals, tutors on call for high school education and tutoring. She was a radio talk show host for Peel Matters, a show on 960 AM. She was working in the vaccination clinic support group, a member of the Peel HIV/AIDS network, individual on the Girls on Boards mentor, a high school teacher, a vice chairman of the board of Savis of Halton, and more and more and more. It goes on. You've been involved in a ton of really interesting topics.
Well, Brian, I'm 52 just about now. So yeah. I guess I sort of started young volunteering, right? I think my first endeavor into the not-for-profit world was, yeah, I think I was just starting university, and I was on the board of the United Nations Toronto chapter. And that sort of started me getting a little bit more involved in supporting agencies. So yeah, and that sort of just continued. And I have to be honest with you, and I say this even to the young folks that I've mentored on the Girls on Boards. Now it's called Fora. The organization has changed its name because it serves women and gender diverse folks. That it's really sort of, what are you passionate about, and really sort of dive in. But the skills that I've learned, when you're on a not-for-profit board, for one, you don't get paid to do it. But in many times, a lot of these organizations, they struggle, and you have to wear many hats, as you know, Brian. You probably sit on quite a few boards as well, right? So it puts you in a place where you're doing everything from fundraising, overseeing finances. Sometimes you have to end up taking the reins and actually taking a more operational approach. So, I've experienced many things being a volunteer board member, but it has brought me a tremendous amount of skills. And at the same time, yeah, you just get to see what people are doing on the front line, support them, support the agency, and be sort of like that speaking voice for the agency beyond just the staff or the executive director. So I've always enjoyed doing that. But yeah, I know I've done a lot of different things.
And you left off of that list all of your candidacies, either municipally or federally or provincially.
That's right. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Which you've done numerous different times.
Well, I have to tell you something. So we've just had the passing of Brian Mulroney, right? And it actually was the 1984 election when I first started volunteering in a campaign. Was way back when my high school teacher, God bless her, she's probably gone now, Mrs. Kormanicki, made us actually go and volunteer in a political campaign. She was actually she was very much a Brian Mulroney fan, as well as a fan of free trade. And that's really sort of how I started getting involved in politics, just volunteering on a campaign. And I really started to dive in. What are the values, ideals of each party? Where do I feel I align myself? And I just aligned myself with the NDP from the very beginning,
And what campaign was that in 1984?
Yeah, that was I forget the gentleman's name, but he was here in Arundel area, and I volunteered on his campaign. So it was Ed Broadbent, Brian Mulroney, and John Turner. The issue was of the day, or at least was talked about, was free trade. And so that was sort of my dive into getting more politically astute and understanding the impact of policy on the ground and how it affects all of us. So
So,
yeah.
Michelle, in the last couple of years, housing affordability has become a big issue, and it's housing affordability for everyone that has really been sort of front and center in the newspapers and in the media in regards to inflation, particularly in real estate prices, that became even more profound when the interest rates upticked and people not only couldn't afford the houses but could really not afford the mortgages on the very expensive houses. But homelessness during that has sort of fallen to the wayside. And Mayor Olivia Chow, I think, is really putting a new effort on social housing and more inclusionary zoning. Why have we gotten to this situation?
Mm, yeah. I think I think it's 30 years in the making, Brian, to be honest with you. I think our understanding, quite frankly, if you go to other countries in the world, our understanding of what housing is for is very different here. We see it as an investment. We see it as a nest egg. We see it as in something that we retire with in the end, and we rely on that. Whereas what we should be seeing, and many countries around the world do see that housing is a human right. And so we are seeing a bit of that language just start coming back to into our discourse. But that is just sort of the what we've seen around us as far as even in my life. This is what you strive for, right? You go up that housing ladder, right? You start off with your parents and rent, and eventually home ownership, and then you retire and maybe sell your house, and there you go, you have some money financing your retirement, right? So I think that has been I think generally speaking the discourse of most Western countries nowadays. But in addition, it was, I would have to say, the 80s and 90s, that social democracy sort of framework, that really created our healthcare system, for example, sort of fell to the wayside. And we saw the time again, Brian Mulroney, Thatcherism, Mulroneyism, and as well as Reaganomics. It became, free trade, again, globalization. I think all of those things have sort of affected policy for a very long time, and we actually saw the federal government during the 80s, that time, uh, steer away from social programs. Um, they left. They stopped building social housing, stopped funding cooperative housing, and so here we are, 30 decades later, when the government hasn't, put a substantial investment into social housing and affordable housing. I think we've gotten to this point, so I think that had an impact on it. And again, also just, predominantly, especially over the last 15, 20 years, it's also the foreign investment piece too, investing in general, as an economic value of housing instead of as a human right, and various other global economic situations have been, it's just created this perfect storm, I think.
So you think it's
And
primarily number one, economic, and number two, that governments have paid less attention to the social democratic sort of issues. I've interviewed some other people on homelessness,
mhm,
and they've identified that while your experience isn't unique, that there is a certain segment of homelessness people that are between jobs or
mhm,
leaving bad marriage. There's a list of sort of reasons why people might be homeless for a while. Most of the long-term homelessness, they would suggest, is mental health related,
mhm,
and that so therefore the issue is not just homelessness; it's really a compound problem in regards to our lack of appropriate resources for mental health.
right. And
And
I
they
mean,
go further and say that a lot of the drug use is particularly the sort of the illicit, illegal drug use that is out in the open, is often related to both homelessness and mental health. And so all three of the issues are connected. What do you think about that?
well, first of all, just like, again, knowing the data, um, I would I would have to say that if you look at the data, most people do not experience chronic homelessness, as you said, right? It's usually um, non-reoccurring, something that's more short term, and so the supports necessary to will only be that, right? Those experiencing chronic homelessness, there's usually compounding multiple morbidities, which many of them you just sort of addressed, right? So physical, mental health issues, disabilities, various things, that also affects a person's ability, yeah, to actually work, right? And we know that our social assistance rates, ODSP, and it's very minimal. 1,200 bucks for an individual who still has to pay for the $700 or $800 for their housing doesn't leave them for very much else, to survive. And yeah, I mean, certainly, let's face it, you're living in your car, you're on your street, you're homeless, you're in a shelter, nutrition out the wayside, sleeping out the wayside. How does that affect a person's biological well-being, right? Their mental health, all of these things. Again, I think it's various different issues that have sort of, created, I guess, sort of what most people see today is those that are in major crisis. But a majority, like I said, of most folks who are experiencing homelessness are either, are hidden couch surfing. And the individuals we see, we do try our best, I think, and the region really does try their best from a very person-centered perspective, to support people and those dynamic, multiple issues that the individual is experiencing, because I think in the end we'd all like people to have a successful and substantial existence. But I also have to say there are some methodologies that have worked very,
Such
very
as,
well
such as?
for like housing first. And I think you hear it quite often, housing first, and people think, oh, you put a person in housing first. But housing first isn't just a philosophy, it's actually a program. And I would say about 10, 15 years ago, it really was Canada and the at-home chez soi program that was done by the Canadian Mental Health Association that really put housing first to the forefront, which is now considered a global best practice on ending homelessness. And so there's multiple different aspects to that, one of which is individual choice, right? As being able to have a caseworker working with you from the very beginning. When you walk into the shelter or a service provider, you're put on a list, right? So that's what's called the by name list. And the by name list of people experiencing homelessness is usually a list it's not a first come first served type of list. It's based on a person's chronic conditions, right? And you assess that. Region is doing that. So they walk into the shelter, there's usually some sort of form of assessment that's done, and the individual is put on the by name list. Now, housing first also means an individual's choice. So you have a case person, you work with them, you coach them to a better life. So that individual talks about where do you want to live? Has a good idea of, okay, do they need supportive housing? Do they want to get back and live independently? And it is their choice. Housing first is also about scattered sites. So it's not institutionalizing people. And I call sometimes supportive housing is quasi-institutional, because the individuals living on site, their food, it's almost like a long-term care or retirement home, right? And the individual has all their supports on site. But a lot of people, they want to live independently in the community they want to live in. And Housing First has an ACT team or a FACT team. So it's a flexible assertive engagement team that actually goes to where the person is at. So, the
And
Housing
what,
First
tries
team,
to find a basement apartment or
yeah,
or something like that?
yeah, whatever they can afford. So it's usually the Housing First team that sets them up, with does that landlord engagement strategy and community engagement strategy, and has those multiple visits, whether they're on the phone or in
Sounds
person.
very involved. Is it
Yeah.
bureaucratic?
No, it's not. Like I said, it's a program that was started with the Canadian Mental Health Association, the At Home Chez Soi program. You can look it up. The Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness houses the toolkit. So it's like literally, this is how you do housing first, right? As a program. And I think the understand
I was told though that there's something like a 17-year wait for
for that.
housing in Peel.
Yeah,
Like
they
doing what you're describing on a one-off basis with everyone, if there's a 17-year wait, sounds like it's never gonna, crack the problem at all.
yeah. So I would have to say, and this is a part of some of the work that we were doing in community, right? When I started with the Canadian, before I started the Canadian Alliance, the Canadian Alliance was doing the 20,000 homes campaign, which was an appropriation of the 100,000 homes campaign in the US. And that really was about, you have the social housing waiting list, but this is creating a specific by name list. So, people by name, all their experiences of people who are experiencing homelessness currently. And it was that campaign between service providers on the ground. United Way actually funded that we went out. This is back in 2014. Bunch of community service providers, people like myself. We had a needs assessment tool, which is actually used globally. It's called the VI SPDAT. And we went out and we surveyed individuals on the streets. That became what was called the very first region appeal by name list. And actually, it was that group of individuals that became the Peel Alliance to End Homelessness. And so the Peel Alliance to End Homelessness is a group of various different agencies who basically created that by name list, and also has been working around systems change with respects to homelessness, right? So the region does utilize the by name list, and appropriately, the coordinated systems approach is really.
But if we're doing all this, why do we
Mhm.
still have a problem?
Yeah, yeah. Well, there's not enough social affordable housing for people. I don't think, the region is the beast of municipalities, and the region has only so much money. We've had the downloading of multiple services over many, many years to the municipalities, and here in our case, the regional government, with very few fiscal resources to do the work that they need to do. So a lot of the work, as you know, for many, 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 many years is about region getting its fair share. Our population has boomed since I
I was
started
I
living
was I
here,
was chair
right?
I was chair of the Mississauga Summit back in 2007,
I
and
think I was at that one. Yeah,
something called Fair Share
fair
Peel
share, Peel. Yeah,
was a big issue, and it was
yeah,
something like we were getting 1/5 or 1/6 on a per capita basis of the funding that the city of Toronto got, and it was
exactly.
based on historical census numbers that were updated like
Still,
every 10 or 20
still is,
years, and
still
so
is.
for any
Yeah,
growing community, they got dramatically less funding.
yeah.
Um, so that was clearly a problem, but how are we going to solve this? Actually, we got to take a break for some messages. And when we come back, I'm going to ask Michelle Bilek, how are we going to solve this? How are we going to, like, I'm astounded that Michelle has described to us all these things that are happening and going on. And yet we still have this massive problem. And it's a problem that exists in Mississauga in cars. And as she says, couch surfing. And in Toronto, we see it on the streets. And I've seen it more and more in encampments. There's just no question. As I walk down on the waterfront, Toronto, I'm surprised at how many people are in lean-tos and tents and things like that.
Mhm.
We're gonna take a break and be back in 2 minutes with Michelle Bilek talking about homelessness tonight. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. One of those people that's always impressed me in our community is Michelle Bilek. I've heard of her. I've seen her political signs. I've looked at her websites. I've had people recommend her to me as someone that is really involved in the community and knows what's going on. And we got the privilege of chatting with her tonight about homelessness. She currently is the principal consultant with an organization called the Real People Collaborative. And she really is all about the development and implementation of social service programs, policies, and government relation strategies. We've been talking about homelessness. Michelle, before I ask you the question about what we're going to do about this, I wanted to make one other comment if I could, and that is I was at a real estate developers convention a little while ago, and one of the people up on stage, and this is for-profit real estate developers that get a bad rap a lot of the time, and he said, one of the things that we don't focus on is that it's actually good economics to solve
Mhm.
homelessness. That if we leave people on the streets, they use emergency services like police, like fire, like paramedics, and like hospital emergency rooms to an incredibly inordinate degree, because that's where they go when they're sick, when they're cold, when they need some food, when they need their medicine, when they need their pills, etc.
Mhm.
That a lot of them have mental health issues, and that if we actually housed them,
Mhm.
it would be, from a taxpayer standpoint, from a society standpoint, actually fiscally responsible. So doing the right thing is actually fiscally responsible.
Yep.
So if that's true, which is appealing to sort of the people at the right end of the spectrum, and you're right about, we've got this problem, which is, and we're not dealing with it. We've been underinvesting in social services, which appeals to the people sort of left of center.
Mhm.
How come we haven't solved this problem?
Yeah, yeah. I've been saying that for a very long time. It's not only the socially responsible thing to do, but the economically responsible thing to do as well. Politics is politics, to be honest with you. I'm really glad, though. I have to say I agree with you. A lot of our for-profit development sector are really starting to keenly look at this as an issue. And again, it's becoming like housing affordability, like you mentioned at the beginning of the program, is something that's affecting a lot of basically multiple generations and even influential and economically stable people. So that's a great thing. But yeah, it's to me it's no brainer, right? and you look at like Sweden, right, or any country in the Netherlands, and they've been doing it right for decades.
And
And
doing it
again,
right is what?
they've been investing in social services at the same time. Um, they have a full spectrum of various different types of housing. Governments own the land. This is something that we've done again wrong. Selling off every nook and cranny, unfortunately, to the development sector has put us in a place where not even governments can afford to build what we need anymore, because to buy the land is very, very expensive. And again, really, utilizing tax dollars appropriately. If we have people healthy and happy, we have a happy and healthy economy too, right? So, when people are struggling, it's a major burden on our economic system, right? So to me, it's just a no-brainer. But you know, how do we solve this problem? Well, Brian, we've seen forest fires, right? We've seen floods in this country. We've seen an all government, multiple jurisdictional approach to address these issues. And unfortunately, what we see is a lot of finger pointing. I see it still at the region. I love Nando. He was my, he was my first sort of conversation I ever had with a local counselor. I love him. But he still says the same thing, right? It's that they're not funding us and they're not giving us money, and rightly so. That is true. Like fair share appeal is still an ongoing issue. But, we have to stop pointing fingers, and we have to start collaborating and working together on all levels of government. Stop, put partisanship aside, like a fire or a flood or any other massive emergency that we see happening. Everybody just pitches in. It's not about money anymore. It's about saving people's lives. And if we really, really started looking at homelessness and housing precarity and poverty in general as an emergency issue, which many, many cities have stated it is, then, I think how we would deal with it would be frankly quite differently. And I think that's really what it comes down to is we need an all government, all departmental approach, because how affordable housing affects every department and these social issues yeah, they affect all levels of government. So
Michelle,
this is
I'm
sort of what we need. Yeah.
I'm really worried it's going to get worse.
Mm,
I'm hearing more and more comments from landlords that people are late on rent checks, and it's not a tsunami yet, but the leading indicator of potential problems to come is when people start paying their rent late, because
mhm.
typically people will they'll go late on their credit card payment, they'll go late even on their car payment, but the one thing they never want to risk losing is the place that they live. And so that's the last thing that you're typically late on.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard about several retailers that are struggling. And we've had a couple of bankruptcies recently with some retailers. And I think this comes back to, how life affordability, not housing affordability necessarily,
Mm-hmm.
but life affordability. And so housing is one of those big issues, but it's also inflation. And while inflation may be down, it's not negative. And so therefore prices are still high. And so I think
Yeah.
people are having a challenging time. And higher interest rates have certainly squeezed out a lot of people, whether it's because of mortgages or because of interest on credit cards or payday loans or whatever it is that they have to pay interest on. But I think that's squeezing people. So I got to ask you,
Mm-hmm.
if things get even worse in the next little while, and a lot of people are calling for a recession, and now most people are saying, no, it's not going to be a recession, it's going to be a soft landing. But if things get even worse, what are we going to do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's like you're like, I don't want you to philosophize some sort of absolute conundrum, but yeah, and I always have to stay hope. I mean, I don't know, people are seeing me on the camera, but I'm always smiling because I always have hope. And that sometimes, eh, when things bottom out, when things get so difficult, um, that's usually when, for some reason, us as human beings rise up and we see drastic changes in the way that we do things. So sometimes it really does take an astronomical catastrophe in order to bring about change, unfortunately. And
The old crisis is opportunity.
yeah, always. I think I'd like to think so, because remember when I told you when was going door to door back in 2008, and people would be like, "What are you talking about homelessness, Leah? Why are you talking about these issues with me?" I can't relate to that, right? Well, they were, they're fine. They were baby boomers at the time, more likely than not, and they have their housing and their kids and the cars and everything like that. So to them, they just couldn't relate. Well, guess what? I think most people can relate now. They have kids, right? The kids are struggling. There's a tremendous amount of fear and anxiety, I think, from all generations at this point, right? Like what's going to happen to us? What could happen
I
tomorrow?
interviewed some people from the food bank, and they said that food bank usage is up dramatically,
Yeah.
and this winter has been one of the heaviest demands on food banks. And it was interesting because they were saying that the increase in food bank usage wasn't, as you've described it, chronic homelessness.
No.
It was people that were between something. It was people that had lost a job before they could
Mhm.
get a job, or people, they said Ukrainian refugees were one of the biggest users.
Oh, for
So
sure.
people that just newly arrived in Canada. They described a lot of people that had left abusive situations as a problem, and that a lot of these people were going to get back on their feet, and they were
Yeah.
confident they were going to get back on their feet, but they had a problem for a while, and they thought that it was part of society's responsibility to help them through that interim time period. What do you think about that?
Hmm. I think it can also just go back to my situation. I think it takes a lot. You have to be pretty humble, like in most circumstances. I, sometimes I hear those conversations like, oh, people are sitting on their couch and they're eating Doritos and they're taking the dough. I'm telling you that that scenario is far and in between. Most of the people who are seeking crisis services is because they are in crisis. And it takes a lot, I think, of courage to actually seek out supports. It's not something that people want to do. I think most people want to have a job. They want to put in a good days of work. It makes you feel human when you're able to to contribute like everybody else. When you're able to participate in society the way that we should be. And I think that when you're in a situation where you don't feel that you have dignity, and you don't feel dignified, that it is not something people are proud of. But sometimes, um, you know, I'm very glad that we have these services. But again, Brian, food banks, you can ask me again from the food bank, how did food banks evolve? Well, that was that 1980s time, right? So, I think certainly our reliance on social services is the result of the lack of investment in people, right? And community services over decades, right? I mean, yeah, we now rely heavily on social services, some of which you don't get any money except charitable organizations. I even sometimes say our economy is on the backs of volunteerism, because quite honestly, in many cases it is.
It is, no question. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in 2 minutes with some concluding comments with Michelle Bilek about a housing crisis that we've got in Canada, in the Greater Toronto Area, and certainly in Mississauga and Peel in regards to homelessness. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Michelle Bilek. She's an activist in the Peel area, Mississauga area, politically and social services oriented, and her passion right now is homelessness. She's also been very involved in AIDS issues, HIV issues, in food issues, and one of those people that I've heard of involved in a lot of different social issues in the past. And so it's a real pleasure of mine to get to know her tonight and what she's all about. Michelle, I got to ask you, we had sort of a test of a guaranteed annual income during the pandemic with the CERB. I interviewed Dalton Camp, who was a Canadian politician, a progressive conservative Canadian politician, who really thought the solution to social issues was a guaranteed annual income. And the way he described it to me in an interview I did it with him was that he thought that when you treated people like adults, they acted like adults. When you treated them like kids, they act like kids. And he thought that this over bureaucratic, have them come in every week for a little bit of, to get their check, to report on what they're doing, to ask if they're finding a job, to ask this thing and that thing, that they would act like kids, and they wouldn't take responsibility for their own actions. But if you actually gave them money in a guaranteed annual income and treated them like adults, that they could make the best decisions for themselves, that they would do so. What do you think? Was the CERB a guaranteed annual income? Is a guaranteed annual income a good idea? What do you think?
Okay.
What do you think?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We've always called it a livable income. A livable income. Everyone needs a livable income, right? And honestly, I think that the cost of living has not matched necessarily with a person's income in general, right? But I do agree with that. I really do. I think that you've hit it right on the head, the nail hit on the head, because it really is an important aspect. I think, again, going back to saying that people want to have a dignified life, right? People don't want to necessarily have to seek out social supports for any reason. And so, yeah, in this economic situation that we're in, our income, our the levels and salaries that people are making doesn't match with the cost of living whatsoever, and that's whether it's groceries or rent or housing costs, or in many cases people don't even have any sort of form of medical care, right? So like everything sort of adds up over a while, and so certainly when an individual is capable of just having those basic necessities that people need to have just to live their life daily, then usually you have a social and an economic vibrancy in many of those countries that actually have some of those social safety nets, including, like you said, a livable wage of some sort.
So, Michelle, if you were the mayor of Mississauga or the chair of the Region Appeal, what would you do?
Oh no. Yeah, that's a really great question. Thank you for asking, but I wouldn't want the job, to be honest with you. I think it's a very difficult one. But it really, I think, is about community building. And we need a leader who has passion, compassion for others, right? Put our egos aside, right? Get down there, visit the shelter, start talking to people, walk down the street, say hello, and really sort of listen. Listening to people. I've always said, a plethora of my knowledge has come from lived experts. You know, I I haven't learned these things from reading a book or doing research. I learn about solution making from people. When you listen to people and their lived experiences, that's when you can actually find solutions. So it really is about yeah, just speaking with people, the people you serve, and getting a better sense of their needs.
Michelle Bilek, thank you so much for joining us. I really
Yeah,
appreciate it.
no, thank you
So
for
that's our show for tonight. I got to tell you that I think that, I think that this housing affordability issue, and for those of you that have been following my show for a while, I've been really focused on housing affordability because I think it is the crisis of the time right now in Canada. If the climate crisis is maybe the crisis of the generation, I think that the housing crisis is the crisis of sort of today, because I think a lot of people just don't have that ability to afford a home anymore. And we're going to end up, if we're lucky, living in a 500 square foot apartment. And that's if you're lucky. But I do think that we've forgotten about the issue that Michelle is focused on at the same time, which is those that even can't get that 500 square foot place. And homelessness really is an issue. And I think one of the solutions is these legalization of basement apartments that people have talked about, and or extra suites in middle housing or middle income housing. The missing middle, I think, is what they call it. But I don't think that's the real solution. I think the real solution long term is we've got to build more housing. and we've got to build more housing. And some of it's got to be deep affordable. And I think there are government incentives that you can put in place to achieve that, whether it be land for free, cheap land, and or inclusionary zoning, where unlike the way that Toronto implemented it, where they just demanded it, in numerous other cities around North America, what they did, what municipalities did when they implemented inclusionary zoning, was they gave the developers a benefit in exchange for the inclusionary zoning. So they said, if you build 10% of your units affordable, we'll give you 10 more stories. Because otherwise, when you think about it, what ends up happening is if you just demand it, it's all the other people that have bought or rented units in that existing building that are effectively paying the tax to allow the affordable homes and units to exist. And that's not fair. This is a societal problem. It shouldn't be the developer that pays it. It shouldn't be the other homeowners that pay it. It should be society in general that pays it. And the easiest and best way to do it is give them an extra couple of floors of density, which I think is pretty easy and free to give. But I think that the developers have got to produce something for that, which is the affordability. I also think the CMHC loans that are in place today that for deep affordable homes that add up to 10 or 20% of all the homes. So it's not the whole place, and so therefore it is that mixed income that you talked about, Michelle. It's not sort of institutionalized. It's 10 or 20%. But you end up getting cheap financing. And in an era of high interest rates, that cheap financing is pretty attractive. So there are some solutions. We need to look at them, but we need to know that this problem exists, because fixing a problem, the first step is understanding that it's there. And I really thank you, Michelle, for raising our consciousness in this regard. That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can see me on social media as well. All my podcasts and website, all my podcasts and videos are posted to my website, briancrombie.com, and social media as soon as the show goes to air. Thanks, Michelle. Good night, everybody.